Hey guys, welcome to our first lecture of chapter 16. We're going to spend a lot of this year talking about evolution. It is one of the big four unifying themes in the AP curriculum, and it's not a topic that I shy away from by any means. I actually think it's pretty interesting. But being at a Christian school, we are going from a different starting point than I think than a naturalist or a naturalistic worldview would certainly take a different starting point to look at these things. But the actual evidences, the ideas, the theories, the data, those are all the same. And my hope is that as we progress through these chapters, that you'll find that the evidence that exists fits okay in your worldview. I really think it will. But if you have any questions, which I think you will, and I hope you will, if you don't have questions and you're not thinking about it, please bring them to class, and we will certainly discuss this. So we're going to talk about the theory of evolution, evidences for it, and how it developed, and it's going to be a pretty good time. So let's jump right into it. Your book starts with looking at how we look at the distant past. So reflecting on the history of the world, there's a lot of different things you can look at to try to figure out how old the world is, what's happened in the past. We tend to look at physical evidences of past events. That's how we reconstruct ancient history. If you want to reconstruct a civilization, you try to look at their buildings. You try to look at artifacts they left behind. And really, all that's left behind in the present is all we can use to learn anything, really, about the past. And so we look at physical evidence of what we have today, and we try to figure out what these past events were like. Your book gives you the example of a Barringer crater in Arizona, and it was created by an asteroid, impacted the Earth. We think this happened about 50,000 years ago. Now, how we get that date can be a little tricky, but it was certainly a while ago. So 50,000 years ago is the idea. They're guessing that from the soil. There was also a mass extinction in the past that we're putting somewhere around the order of 66 million years ago. And the idea there is that it was marked by this unusual worldwide formation of sedimentary rock called a K, well, I learned it as a KT boundary. Now it's, I guess, a KPG boundary sequence, which means at some point in the world's history, pretty much everything was covered in sediment. Now, as a Christian who believes in a worldwide flood, this is probably a no duh point to you, but for the rest of the world, that's pretty stinking crazy. Sediment, like sand and dirt, lots of it, all at once, covered. And what we find is there are no dinosaur fossils above that KT line, and there are dinosaur fossils below that KT line. So the idea is that, whatever covered the whole world in sediment probably killed the dinosaurs. That's the thought. So here's the Barringer crater in Arizona. Some evidence from rocks points that this asteroid that hit might have been in the order of 300,000 tons, and it hit maybe 50,000 years ago. And this little white line in rock here, that's your KT boundary. It's now called the KPG boundary. Dinosaur fossils down here, no dinosaur fossils up here. There's a pocket knife in this picture. That gives you an idea of how much sediment covered the face of the earth when whatever happened at the KT boundary time frame. So that's tough to get your head around. You imagine that? Like, how wide do you think a pocket knife is? Inch and a half? Inch of sediment covering the entire face of the earth. That's a lot. That's a lot of material. So there you go. So our dinosaur fossils exist below that layer, but not above. There's also a pretty big impact crater near the Yucatan Peninsula, and that date hits around that 66 million years ago. And so a popular idea is that that asteroid impact might have been what killed the dinosaurs, and it would have, when it struck, blown so much material, earthen material, that could have been what covered the sediment all over the earth. And then certainly, that could have been a deal. So let's talk about how people think about the past, because how you think about the past and even the present to some extent, depends on how you write, how you word things, how you view things. And you can even see it in your book in some places. There's been a couple sentences that kind of make me smile because you can tell from the words they use the belief point they start from. And I'm not trying to knock them on it. It's fine. You can tell a lot about someone from their writing. So 2,300 years ago, Aristotle describes nature as a continuum of organization from lifeless matter up through complex plants and animals. Doubtless humans were pretty near the top because we must be the apex of everything. We're the best, I guess. And then in the 1300s, Europeans believed in this great chain of being. And this is kind of funny. It's kind of cool, kind of funny. Extending from the lowest life forms, which you might find comical, were snakes. And you might agree with that, all the way up to humans. Of course, we're the top of the natural world because we're egotistical and think we're just the best. And then from humans, it goes up to angels, and from angels, it goes up to God. And there's even, it's like a classification scheme that runs all the way up to spiritual beings. God's the top, snakes are the bottom, and it runs up to humans and all this kind of stuff. So the idea there was that this whole chain of organization existed and that it was all built at the same time. I might not disagree with that so much, to tell you the honest truth, but the place that I would disagree with it is certainly they thought there's no room and there's no need for change. Like, people are just the way God made them, exactly when He made them. And He made all this other stuff, like snakes and fish and birds and dogs and cats and horses and cows and wheat and corn, blah, blah, blah. And none of that stuff has changed since creation because there's no need for it, because there's just no need for it. I don't know. Like I said, that part I have some serious troubles with, but I'll try not to. My goal is not to indoctrinate you with the opinions of Mr. Stecker, right? It's to educate you so you can make your own decisions. So let's be clear there. So in the 1800s, European naturalists start to go out and explore the world. And when they do, they bring back some stuff that's kind of troubling for people who think nothing's ever changed ever in the world. These guys start to look at what's called biogeography. Biogeography is the study of what animals live where, what plants live where. And if you just sit in some town in Europe, biogeography is very simple, but if you explore the world, biogeography becomes a little more tricky. And what they started to see was they started to see patterns. They started to see patterns in species. What they looked like depended on where they lived. They saw similarities in body plans from animals and plants that were on completely different continents. And some of these similar species were reproductively isolated from each other. Things on islands, things on mountaintops, things that couldn't access other species, but their body plans would look like what they had seen in other places. And so this started to be kind of confusing. One example of this here is we had some birds, none of which fly, but all of which have feathers and wings. Relatively long necks, rather long, strong, fast legs. All of these are about the same distance from the equator. So we have the emu, Australia, the rhea, South America, and the ostrich, Africa. Now, by the looks of them, I'm not anticipating that any of these are very good swimmers, right? So how did they get there? Why do they look alike? These are the questions we have to ask. I mean, if none of these things have ever changed over time, then why do we have successful species with similar body plans in similar habitats? These guys are inhabiting grasslands. Why do they have wings if they don't fly? These are questions that we have to ask ourselves when we look at animals that live all over the world. And so biogeographists, I hope that's a word, naturalists who studied biogeography were reporting this to people, and it was kind of causing some troubles because it raised some questions. Here's another one. A couple of different desert plants living in completely different continents, but they both have big fleshy stems that store lots of water. They both have folded stems, they both have spines, and they both produce flowers. Now, the flowers and reproduction times are different. The species are different, but they look alike because they live in similar environments. And so that sort of plants the seeds for this idea of does the environment affect the organism? That's our question. So some other things that we looked at, and this has been riddled with problems, but we won't pick on it too much, is comparative morphology. And that's the study of anatomical patterns. For example, we just looked at those three birds. Long legs, wings that don't fly, long necks. Why do they look like this? Why are there similarities and differences among these body plans? And are there body parts that don't really have much function? The human appendix was cited for a long time as not having a function. We now know that it does have a function. It plays an important role in our immune system, but we didn't know that, for a long time. Humans have a very short, stubby little tail. It's called the coccyx. It's just tucked in a little kind of C shape there at the bottom of your spine, and as far as functioning as a tail, to our knowledge, it really doesn't do much anything. So the question is, why do you have it? So these things created problems, but they were small problems for those who wanted to claim that life had not changed one little teeny tiny bit since God created it. Which is weird because I haven't found that in Scripture, but hey, I'm no great authority on biblical knowledge either, so take that with a grain of salt. Where the problems started to come in were fossils. Fossils created huge problems because fossils are physical evidence of an organism that lived in the past. And so for people who were like, hey man, the world is just like God created it, nothing's changed, everything's cool, that got weird when people brought them seashells from mountaintops. And we're like, hey, this came from a mountain. And then, well, shoot, that requires some pretty significant change. Again, as young Christians who probably subscribe to a worldwide flood, it's not actually that weird. You should probably find seashells just about anywhere. But for people who thought the world had never changed, that's a big problem for them. So, why do you get these identical sequences of rock formations found all over the world? Why do deep layers of rock have these little simple life forms as opposed to more recent layers that you get like giant ground sloths and historic, like prehistoric rhinos and weird junk like in the Badlands, which is just cool, full of weird little stuff like that. And so some of these discoveries of biogeography, a little bit of our comparative morphology and geology, they all kind of came together and they all sort of started to paint this picture that we're really not seeing that species are going to remain absolutely constant over time. And the evidence for that, I think, is reasonably strong. I would agree with that. Evolution means change. I don't personally believe that, molecule to man kind of evolution, but as far as species changing over time, yeah, I think the evidence for that is pretty good. I think humans have probably always been humans. Horses have probably always been horses, but as far as like the size of those horses and different things like that, coat color, eye color, all sorts of issues like that, height, I mean, yeah, change it up. Yes, absolutely, I think that can happen. So there's the human tailbone. Not really sure. I mean, it doesn't appear to do a whole lot, really. It's just these four fused vertebrae, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's it. That's the coccyx. That's the sacrum. Sacrum has all sorts of nerves running out of it. It's apparently very important. Coccyx, I don't know. I don't really know what it does. It's just this teeny, teeny, tiny, nubby little tail. But there you have it. So let's talk about how these new theories came to be and some of our heavy hitters historically who started to come up with this stuff. The first guy is George Cuvier. Around 1800, he got the idea that the species that had once existed were now extinct. Not that terribly amazing of an idea, but again, for the people who thought that nothing had ever changed at all, this is a big deal. And it's not this terribly difficult to have this theory because, like I said, we have fossils of these giant rhinos and giant ground sloths and huge armadillos. And so you can say, hey, here's a fossil of an armadillo the size of a car. That doesn't exist anymore. And yeah, okay, sure, I totally believe you here. And he also realized that he thought the Earth's surface had changed. And again, he had found seashells, and other people had found seashells, near mountaintops. And to our knowledge, the ocean hasn't been near the mountaintops in a very, very, very long time. So his idea was that the Earth's crust, the surface of the Earth has changed over time. Now, what that time frame might be, that's going to put some folks on the fight. It's going to depend a lot on your worldview, but as far as has the surface of the Earth changed? Sure, I'm not going to fight that. Absolutely. I have my reasons that I think it has, but I'm a biologist, not a geologist. So, again, I'm not the most qualified guy in the whole world to speak on that. So the idea was that his thought was that these were catastrophes, catastrophic geologic forces. He thought there was a big catastrophe, stuff would die, stuff would repopulate, there'd be another big catastrophe, everything would die. That was kind of his idea for how we got these shapes. So then along comes this guy named Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, very cool name. And he got this idea that species improved over time. Now, because you're young Christians, I'm going to warn you. If you hear somebody arguing against evolution and they're using Lamarck's ideas against evolution, which you will sometimes hear, you have my permission to tune them out, because everybody knows Lamarck's idea of evolution is wrong. Evolutionists, creationists, everybody knows that. So don't fight evolutionists with an idea that they already know is wrong, or you're going to sound really, really, really dumb, okay? But know what he thought, because it's cool. It was a springboard for a lot of other guys. He thought these animals possessed an inherent drive to perfection. Now, there's nothing in modern evolutionary theory that says anything about perfection. It really boils down to surviving and making babies. Whether perfect, imperfect, those sort of subjective terms, we'll leave that stuff alone. If you can survive and make babies, you win. If you die, you lose. There's modern evolutionary theory for you in about 5 seconds, right? But he thought there was this idea that there's this perfect thing these animals were trying to accomplish. And he thought that environmental pressures that they lived in caused an internal requirement for change, and that some sort of unknown fluid would move to the area that required the change, and they would change, and they would pass this change on to their descendants, who would be better suited to live in the environment that had that certain pressure. Now, let's not be too hard on the guy. Genes, alleles, even a nucleus, we didn't know about this stuff. I mean, these guys are looking at phenotypes, and that's it. We didn't know genes and alleles and chromosomes were a thing. So he just thought that the fluid caused the change. Now, we know Lamarckian evolution is wrong, and here's why. Bodybuilders don't have buff babies. Cool? You can work hard to acquire a trait, but you're not passing on an acquired trait to your offspring. It doesn't work that way. So a lot of times they'll cite a giraffe for this guy, and they'll say, a long time ago, the giraffe was trying to reach some leaves, so he stretched his neck every day, and his neck was longer, and he meets a lovely lady giraffe who has often spent her time stretching for leaves, and those two get together and have long-necked baby. And of course we know that's not the way it works, and so do evolutionists. So if you're going to argue, please don't use that point, or I'll feel like I've failed as a teacher. Cool? Next thing, new theories. So Charles Darwin, he knows about these guys. He knows about their ideas. He really doesn't want to be in medical school. He really thinks school is boring. He really doesn't want to work with the church. So he decides to go to South America on an expedition because I don't know, why not? He's young, his family's reasonably wealthy, he's got nothing going on, he's not really doing anything with his education, but he's pretty sharp. He's just bored in school. I mean, I'm sure some of you guys are like, yeah, I can get that. So he becomes a naturalist, which is basically the best job ever. You travel the world, you capture little birds and crabs and put them in cages and bring them back to your country and write about them, and you just travel. It's awesome. Why not? So he knew this guy's writings named Charles Lyell, and Charles Lyell had this really cool idea, not about animals, not about evolution. Charles Lyell looked at geology, and he had this idea that the theory of uniformity, these gradual repetitive changes, had shaped the earth, that the earth might be older than 6,000 years old, which if you take a strict biblical timeline, you're going to get a pretty young planet. But he's thinking it's older. And he thinks these old cyclic changes have changed the earth's shape. Well, I don't want to say shape, surface features. That's what I want to say. And so Darwin's like, okay, cool, I think I can get that. And it challenged the prevailing belief that the earth was very young. And so Darwin's collecting these specimens, and he knows about Charles Lyell's writings and this idea that the earth has maybe changed over a long period of time. And then he reads this writer, Thomas Malthus. And Thomas Malthus, again, is not about biology. He's not about naturalism. Thomas Malthus is looking at humans. And he gets this cool idea, and it's like this. Human populations have had famine and war that decrease our population, and he thinks he knows why. He correlated an increase in human populations with famine, disease, and war. And so Malthus publishes this idea that basically is like this. Human populations can grow faster than the environment that can support them. And when the human population overshoots what the environment can support, we are stressed. So we either starve and die, we get sick and die, or we go for somebody else's resources and we start a war. But all of these end in death and reducing the human population down. And when that happens, our environment can sustain us, the human population grows again, and once it overshoots what would today be called the carrying capacity, we start the famine or the disease or the war to drop us back down. And so Darwin reads this, and he's looking at all these animals all over the world, and he's like, man, I think he's right. And I think that works for animals too. And so Darwin theorized that populations, all of them, emus and fish and birds, they all have the capability to make more babies than the environment can support. And once that happens, there is stress, there is pressure, and that pressure is going to change stuff. That's the idea. That's how it gets started. And so Darwin, when he grew up, he would see selective breeding in pigeons. You want a white pigeon? Then you take the pigeons you have and you pick the lightest colored pigeons you can find to make babies, and of those babies you choose the lightest colored babies and the lightest colored grandbabies, and over a couple, 2, 3, 4 generations you get a pigeon that's very nearly or entirely white. We can do the same thing with horses. We can do the same thing with dogs. We picked traits we wanted to exist, and we picked who bred to make those traits amplified, if you will. And so Darwin's idea is, if humans can do this, could the environment do this? What if the environment pressures lots of animals, and those with the best traits in that environment survive to make babies? Their babies would look like them and would survive in that environment. And so he gets this idea that nature can put a pressure on animals just like we can put a pressure on animals. And so he calls this an adaptive trait, and that's a heritable trait. Heritable means it can be passed on to your kids. In evolution, if it can't be passed on to your kids, it's not really that important. And that heritable trait enhances an individual's fitness, and fitness is not how many push-ups you can do or your mile time or your 40 time. Fitness is how suitable you are to your environment. If you can survive and make babies, you have very high fitness. If you die and can't make babies, you have no environmental fitness. That's fitness in biology. Okay? Very different. So, we call this idea natural selection, that nature selects for certain traits based on who dies, who survives, who breeds successfully, and who doesn't. And so the idea is that over time, the individuals with the adaptive traits that are beneficial will survive longer and probably make more babies than their less fit rivals who would be out of the picture. Okay? He thought this was the mechanism that drove evolution. The same change that they saw in geology, he thought happened in animals and plants as well. And that was his example of why do all these deserts have plants that look like cacti with spines because their environment selected for that phenotype. Now, Darwin gets all these animals, he gets all these ideas, he goes back to Europe and he sits on them. And he doesn't do anything. I mean, he kind of writes them out, and that's it. He just doesn't do anything with these ideas. He just sits. And Alfred Wallace is a naturalist as well. He's working on some of the same stuff. He's looking at some of the same animals, and he's thinking these same thoughts. What if they've changed over time? And so Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin, they kind of knew each other. So Wallace writes this letter to Darwin, and he says, hey, I'm seeing some animals in some places that look a lot alike. What if they shared a common ancestor a long time ago, and the environment pressured that population over time to what it is today? And Darwin gets this letter, and he publishes on the origin of the species, because in science, it's who publishes first. So I'm actually very pleased with how much credit your guys' textbook gives to Alfred Wallace. I like that. All these biotechs I've taught in, they don't even mention Alfred Wallace. He never gets mentioned. Your book actually has a big old picture of him. I'm super pumped about that. So you could say he is a co-discoverer of natural selection, of evolution. Charles Darwin gets the big statue. Alfred Wallace gets like nothing, but yeah, he really did figure it out at the same time. He outlined evolution by natural selection independently of Darwin, and for all intents and purposes at the same time as Darwin did. And the natural selection theory was credited to both Darwin and Wallace. So here's your principles of natural selection. Observations. What can we see? We can see that natural populations have a capacity to increase in size over time. Animals have babies. Yep, check. As a population expands, resources that are used by its individuals, like food and living space, eventually become limited. Check. When resources are limited, the individuals compete. Yeah, absolutely. Observations about genetics. Now, these guys didn't even know what the word genetics was back then, but that's okay. Individuals of a species share certain traits. Check. Yeah, absolutely. Mule deer look different than horses, right? Cool. Individuals of a natural population vary in the details of the shared traits. Absolutely. Natural variation. You and I, the science class, we're a population of humans. We're all the same species, but we don't look alike. We're different heights, we're different hair color, we're different eye color. We have a variety of traits. These shared traits have a heritable basis in genes. These guys did not. That's not from Darwin or Wallace. No, that's from your biotechs. That's modern evolution, okay? Slightly different forms of those genes, alleles, give rise to variation in shared traits. Cool? You can be a brown-haired guy carrying a blonde-haired allele, to simplify it. It could be blood type or whatever, but you have a variety in your kiddos. Your kiddos will have a variety. So now we got to go to some inferences. Okay. A certain form of a shared trait may make its bearer better able to survive. Cool? Some forms might be better than others to help you survive. Individuals of a population that are better able to survive tend to leave more offspring. Fair enough. It's hard to make babies if you're dead, so I'll go with that point. Thus, an allele associated with an adaptive trait tends to become more common in a population over time. Fair enough. I'm cool with that. Yeah, if you have an allele that gives you a good trait, you have lots of babies, those babies have those alleles, they're going to have babies, and their babies will have those alleles, and they'll become more abundant in the population over time. I'm cool with that. I really don't have arguments there. So what I want you to do is take a look at this. Everything we just mentioned right here. As a young Christian, does any of this idea so far bother you from your worldview? That'd be my question for you. And I'm not trying to say yes or no. I'm saying take an honest look. Let me know in class. Young Christian guy or gal learning evolution, take a look at just what the observations actually are. And you tell me if that is something that is like faith-shaking, borderline traumatic sort of educational experience. Because my thought is it's probably not. Saying that somebody who's better fit to survive in an environment is going to have more babies should not really bother you, I hope. If it does, let me know. I'm not going to criticize you for it. We'll talk about it, truly. We will do that. So That's where we're going to stop for today. We're going to start a new section in the next video. So I hope this makes sense. I hope it's not too terribly complicated. More names and more history than we're used to in most of our chapters, but we're going to talk about history a lot, so it's kind of part of the game. Anyways, that's all I've got for you guys today, so thank you for your time.